I'm late.
That's all right. I'm sure you're dealing with more important affairs. Come.
A quick game then.
If you think you can manage.
I'm Sydney.
And I'm Maddie.
And this is Documents of Persia, Empires and More.
Yes. Today we'll be covering the rise and fall of the Persian Empire, such as the Achaemenid Empire, the Sucleid Empire, the Parthian Empire, the Sassanid Empire, Alexander the Great and Darius III, the Battle of Issus, the Battle of Gaugamela, people like Cyrus, and we even have a musical act!
Oh wait, a musical act?
Yeah.
Mr. Hammond's only giving us 10 minutes. I don't think we have time for a musical act.
I'll just cancel it. I just feel so disappointed. I didn't do this.
Time to begin, isn't it? I get a little bit bigger than it, I'll admit. Hello?
You're fired.
How much time have we spent already?
About a minute.
Well then. The first of the four ruling dynasties of Persia was the Achaemenid Empire. Wait.
Achaemenid. 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 Achaemenid.
The Achaemenid Empire ruled by Cyrus from 558 to 530 BCE. He was a determined and clever leader.
With his military expertise, he led the conquest that recognized the First Persian Empire.
Cyrus started out as a small regional king, but within 20 years worth of victories, he became ruler of an empire that expanded from India to the edges of Egypt.
But in 530s BCE, he fell. However, Cyrus's empire thrived during the reign of his successors.
Darius!
Darius, one of Cyrus's sons, expanded the empire both east and west. By the 6th century BCE, Darius's realm was by far the largest empire the world had seen. However, he was more of an administrator than a conqueror.
To uphold their empire, the Achaemenids needed to communicate with all parts of the empire to make sure they could administer their territories. The solutions they came up with allowed the empire to survive.
Around 520 BCE, Darius began building a new capital at Persepolis. That was a monument to the Achaemenid dynasty and an administrative center. The Achaemenid government relied on a balance between central and local administrations.
Darius split his realm up into 23 satrapies, or districts, each governed by an official satrap, or viceroy. Sort of like the Hunger Games. To keep the different satraps from revolting against the empire, the Achaemenid empires had two strategies. The first made sure each satrapy had military officers to keep an eye on how much power the satraps had. The second strategy was to have agents or imperial spies that traveled throughout the empire with private military forces, known as the eyes and ears of the king. These two strategies helped prevent the great Achaemenid Empire from falling into divided kingdoms.
Darius wanted to improve administrative efficiency by instituting regular tax levies where each satrapy had to pay a certain amount of standardized coins to the imperial court every year. To maintain communication throughout the realm, roads were built, improving communications, trade, and the economy.
All of these roads and the administrative technology allowed the Achaemenid Empire to grow and make Persian influences on their territories.
With political stability, it became impossible to take on public work projects such as forming the Kanat, which were underground canals that led to improved agricultural production and population growth.
Both Cyrus and Darius had a policy of toleration for the cultural traditions and values of the people they ruled. However, Darius' successor, Xerxes, wanted to impose his own values on his people, which did not end well, as you can imagine.
Tension between the Persians and their Greek subjects eventually led to the collapse of the Achaemenid Empire. The Persian Empire kept fighting with the Greek cities for about 150 years without succeeding.
Until Alexander the Great. With Alexander's father's death, Alexander became determined to master his father's dream and to conquer Persia,
which soon led to the Battle of Issus, fought by Darius III and Alexander the Great. Alexander's army was outnumbered by at least 6-1 by Darius's. Darius was extremely confident in his numbers, so he stretched his army across a river, then went all-out attack on Alexander's army. But the king and Alexander responded by doing the same thing, even though Darius had 210,000 men and Alexander only had 35,000.
Alexander sent reinforcements to fight the infantry, which had been placed on one side. Alexander did what most kings, such as Darius, don't usually do. He attacked head-on himself, fighting alongside his fellow men.
As he fought, Darius sat proudly just out of reach of the fight, drinking and laughing at all his fallen enemies. Alexander, seeing this, became so enraged he charged straight for Darius, hoping to kill him.
Darius, seeing Alexander charging straight for him, became so fearful, he hopped on his horse and ran for the hills.
Darius' men, seeing him flee, thought something went wrong and all fled with him in a retreat.
Though Alexander won the battle, he still had strong desire to kill Darius, and eventually captured his mother and daughter. His family was expecting to be killed, but was in fact treated with respect, and Alexander eventually married Darius' daughter and became loved dearly by Darius' family. In fact, Darius' own mother loved Alexander more than her son, thinking that Alexander was more of a king and braver than Darius ever was. She even committed suicide after Alexander's death.
In 334 BCE, Alexander the Great, along with his army of about 48,000 Macedonians, invaded Persia. Though he had far fewer soldiers than the Persians did, the Macedonians' weapons and military skills were much more advanced than the Persians. In 331 BCE, Alexander crushed the Achaemenids in the Battle of Gaugamela, thus disbanding the Achaemenid Empire.
And within that year, the empire founded by Cyrus had dissolved. Alexander then led his forces to Persepolis and proclaimed himself heir to the Achaemenid rulers.
After a brief celebration, they burned the city to the ground. The Achaemenid Empire had crumbled.
But the legacy of the empire by no means was extinct. Alexander proved to Persia and Egypt to be a legitimate successor of the Achaemenids who deserved to be honored.
Unfortunately, Alexander had little time to enjoy his conquest, because he died in 323 BCE, after a brief effort to expand his empire to India.
But the states that succeeded him continued to employ a basic Achaemenid structure of imperial administration. His chief generals split his empire into 3 large realms, which they divided among themselves. The Seleucids had commanded an elite corps of guards in Alexander's army. They also found new cities throughout the realm and attracted Greek colonists to occupy them. These new cities facilitated trade and economic development, both within the Seleucid Empire and beyond.
The Seleucids, as foreigners, faced opposition from native Persians. Satraps often revolted against Seleucid rule and tried to establish their independence. The Seleucids soon lost their holdings in northern India, and the Parthians progressively took over Iran during the 3rd century BCE. The Seleucids soon diminished then vanished, when Roman conquerors put an end to their empire.
Now the Parthians were building their own powerful empire based in Iran, and they spread to Mesopotamia. They kept most of the customs that nomadic peoples had from Asia, such as not having a centralized government. Eventually, they looked more to agriculture and realized that by feeding their horses alfalfa, they'd have better cavalry and could better defend themselves from nomadic invasions.
The Parthians started to seize their independence from the Seleucids when the Parthian satrap rebelled against his overlord in 238 BCE. Around 171 BCE, Mithridates I came to the throne and made his state into a powerful empire. He became the Parthians' greatest conqueror.
The Parthians portrayed themselves as enemies of the Seleucids and as restorers and rule of the Persian tradition. This was somewhat true, but the Parthians also kept some of their own traditions.
For instance, their regime wasn't nearly as centralized as the Achaemenids, or as the Seleucids. Instead, the majority of the responsibility lay in the hands of their satraps, who would often rebel against the imperial government.
The Parthians ruled over a mighty empire between India and the Mediterranean for about 3 centuries. It was the Roman Empire's expansion that caused tension. This tension, plus the rebellious satraps, weakened the Parthian state, which eventually fell in the early 3rd century CE.
Nevertheless, do you like that word? Nevertheless?
Indeed.
Yes. Quite well. Nevertheless! The tradition of the imperial rule lingered, as the Sassanids came from Persia to overthrow the Parthians in 224 CE and ruled until 651 CE. Yes, life began to flourish in this golden soil. The Sassanid, king of kings, proved to be a mighty ruler from their capital, Ctesiphon. Trade went on between the Sassanids and the peoples to both sides of their realm.
During the reign of Shapur I, they were able to stabilize their western frontier and create a series of buffer states between themselves and the Roman Empire. After his rule, the Sassanids started to engage in serious conflicts over these states, with the Kushan Empire in the east and the Roman and Byzantine empires in the west.
Fighting in these disputes was enervating, especially for the Sassanids, whose empire eventually fell in 651 CE. When Arab warriors killed the last Sassanid ruler, they took over his empire, adding territory to the quickly growing Islamic empire.
Yet the legacy of classical Persia continued. The Arab conquerors used Persian administrative techniques and cultural traditions for their own purposes in establishing a new Islamic society. And that's it! Hope you enjoy the show!
Now get out!